Imagine you owe $1 trillion. Now, imagine you have the power to create dollars whenever you want. So why not just print $1 trillion, pay off the debt, and move on? It sounds almost too easy. Governments around the world owe enormous amounts of money. And unlike an ordinary person, a government controlling its own currency can influence how much of that currency exists. So why does government debt matter at all? Why borrow money? Why collect taxes? Why worry about interest payments? Why not simply create the money needed to pay everything back? Because there's a problem hiding behind that seemingly perfect solution. A government can create money, but it cannot simply create unlimited purchasing power. And once you understand the difference, government debt starts to look very different. Let's say the government has a massive debt payment coming due. Instead of borrowing more money or raising taxes, it decides to create the money itself. The central bank creates new money, and that money enters the financial system. The government can then use it to make payments to creditors. On paper, it looks brilliant. The debt gets paid. No new taxes. No painful spending cuts. No need to find another lender. But there's an important question. Where did the money actually come from? It didn't come from new factories, new houses, more oil, or more food. It was simply created as new units of currency. And that distinction is crucial. Because money isn't wealth by itself. Money is a way of claiming a share of the goods and services an economy produces. If the amount of money increases much faster than the amount of things people can actually buy, those claims begin competing with each other. And that is where the seemingly simple solution starts to become dangerous. When people hear the phrase printing money, they often imagine a government literally running a printing press and producing piles of banknotes. Modern money creation is more complicated than that. Much of the money in a modern economy exists digitally, and central banks can create reserves electronically. Governments, commercial banks, and central banks also play different roles in the process. But for our question, the important idea is simple. More currency or bank money can enter the economy without a matching increase in real goods and services. Imagine an economy producing $100 billion worth of goods. Now, imagine the amount of money available to spend suddenly increases dramatically, while production stays roughly the same. The economy hasn't become richer simply because more dollars exist. There are still the same houses, the same amount of food, the same amount of energy, the same number of cars. But now there are more dollars competing to buy them. If that imbalance becomes large enough, prices can rise. And that brings us to the biggest problem with using newly created money to eliminate government debt. The debt may disappear from the government's balance sheet, but the economic cost doesn't necessarily disappear. This is where inflation enters the story. Imagine a small economy with 100 identical houses for sale and enough money circulating for people to buy them. Now, imagine the amount of money available to spend suddenly doubles, but the number of houses doesn't. There are still only 100 houses. The economy didn't magically build another 100, but buyers now have more money competing for the same limited supply, so sellers can charge more. The same basic pressure can happen across an economy when demand grows faster than the economy's ability to produce goods and services. This doesn't mean every increase in the money supply automatically causes runaway inflation. Real economies are much more complicated, but it shows the fundamental problem. Creating money can change the number of dollars people have. It doesn't automatically increase the amount of stuff those dollars can buy. And if a government tried to create enormous amounts of money specifically to eliminate its debt, people might begin expecting higher inflation. Those expectations matter. Businesses may raise prices. Workers may demand higher wages. Investors may demand higher returns. And people may become less willing to hold the currency. At that point, the government has solved one problem, but potentially created another. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. If newly created money allows a government to pay its debt, it might look as though nobody had to sacrifice anything. But someone can still bear the cost. Consider a person holding a large amount of cash. If prices rise significantly, that cash buys less than it did before. The same can happen to people receiving fixed payments or investors holding assets whose returns don't keep pace with inflation. So the government may have reduced the real burden of its debt, while simultaneously reducing the purchasing power of money already held by the public. This is why inflation is sometimes described as a hidden tax. It's not literally the same as a tax collected by the government, and the analogy has limits. But the basic idea is powerful. When a currency loses purchasing power, people holding that currency can effectively bear part of the economic cost. And there's another problem. Government debt isn't just a number owed to some mysterious lender. A large portion can be held by pension funds, banks, investment funds, companies, and ordinary investors. So deliberately weakening the currency to make debt easier to repay can damage the very financial system that depends on that currency. Which raises an even bigger question. If governments really can create money, why do they sometimes do it anyway? And why does it always cause immediate economic chaos? Here's the part that makes this question genuinely complicated. Governments and central banks do create money. And during major crises, central banks have sometimes expanded the amount of money and reserves in the financial system dramatically. So why didn't those actions automatically produce runaway inflation? Because the relationship between money and prices isn't a simple switch. It depends on what is happening throughout the economy. If businesses have unused capacity, consumers aren't spending aggressively, banks aren't rapidly expanding credit, or the economy is experiencing a major downturn, additional money may not immediately translate into higher consumer prices. But when demand becomes stronger than the economy's ability to produce goods and services, inflationary pressure can increase. And expectations matter too. If people believe a central bank will eventually control inflation, they may continue trusting the currency. But if they start believing that governments will continually create money whenever debt becomes difficult to manage, confidence can weaken. That is the real constraint. A government with a sovereign currency may have considerable power to create money, but its ability to preserve the value of that money is not unlimited. And that is why simply printing enough currency to eliminate government debt isn't the free lunch it appears to be. So, could a government technically create enough money to pay off a huge portion of its debt? In some circumstances, yes. But the real question isn't whether the government can create the currency. It's what happens afterward. If the economy is producing more goods and services, inflation is low, and people trust the currency, additional money creation may be manageable. But if a government repeatedly creates enormous amounts of money simply because it doesn't want to tax, cut spending, or borrow, the consequences can become much more serious. Prices can rise. The currency can lose purchasing power. Interest rates can increase. Investors may demand greater compensation for holding government debt. And if confidence deteriorates far enough, people may try to move their wealth into other currencies or real assets. So the government hasn't actually discovered a magical way to make debt disappear. It has shifted the problem. Instead of asking, how do we repay the debt? The economy may eventually be asking, how do we preserve the value of the money? And that is a much harder problem to solve. So, why can't governments simply print money to pay their debt? The surprising answer is, they can create money, but they can't create wealth simply by creating currency. A government can use newly created money to meet financial obligations. But the real economic cost can show up somewhere else, through inflation, weaker purchasing power, higher borrowing costs, or reduced confidence in the currency. And that's the fundamental problem. Government debt is ultimately a claim on future economic resources. Creating more money can change who holds those claims and how much they're worth. But it doesn't create the factories, homes, energy, food, technology, or productivity needed to make an economy richer. So, the next time someone says, why doesn't the government just print money and pay off the debt? There's a better question to ask. What happens to the money after they print it? Because you can create more dollars. You can't print more purchasing power.